Check, check. Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? All the way in the back as well? Awesome. Welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore right down the street. On behalf of our store and the Ann Arbor District Library, thanks for joining us tonight as we celebrate John U. Bacon's latest, The Greatest Comeback, How Team Canada Fought Back, Took the Summit Series, and Reinvented Hockey. John will be, of course, happy to sign books for you at the table that's right in the back there after the talk. And we, Literati Bookstore, are in the lobby past us on your way in to sell you copies. As a reminder, the library closes this evening at 8, so we'll be on hand to assist with Post-it notes to place inside any copies you may wish to have signed and inscribed by John. And just allow me to say some further remarks before I bring up Ira Weintraub. This is our 7th event with John U. Bacon as Literati Bookstore. The last time I introduced him was on the stage of Hill Auditorium for Overtime way back in 2019, which feels like last year, and also 10 years ago at the same time. But I've sort of been reminiscing and realizing that you can count time by Bacon's books, which are each maddeningly as unique, complete, and peerlessly well-written as he is prodigious in completing them, and then, of course, touring like mad and meeting their ever-growing international society of admirers. So on behalf of Literati, at the very least, in a time of continued tumult, we find no small comfort in his metronomic pace and opportunity to support books like this. And serious excitement, too. I have to admit, as big as a sports fan as I think John knows I am, I'm next to clueless about hockey. Growing up in Iowa as a Michigan transplant, all my childhood Red Wings indoctrination was thoroughly deprogrammed. But it's impossible not to be allured by a project like The Greatest Comeback, which combines the indefatigable depth of research you've come to expect from Bacon, the historical chops displayed in his bestseller, The Great Halifax Explosion, and an unforgettable sports comeback story. And not just any, as those of you already familiar know that the titular The Greatest here is no hyperbole. Team Canada's Herculean final suite of games in Moscow is the kind of sports story you couldn't script if you were asked to, the kind of geopolitical stakes in sports we may never see again. And Bacon has rescued first-hand accounts of this epic and weaved them into his singular and propulsive style. So who else could you think of to handle a story like that? But enough from me. Please join me in welcoming to introduce John U. Bacon, WTKA's Ira Weintraub.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Literati, and thank you, Ann Arbor District Library. I am Ira Weintraub from Sports Talk 1050 WTK The Ticket, and we take this time out from football season to talk some hockey. Here with my good friend John U. Bacon, New York Times bestselling author, commentator, radio contributor, professor, husband, father, half Canadian. The list goes on, and we even used to host the Red Berenson show together, so we've talked a lot of hockey together. I've even been in a few of his books, but not this one, not the Halifax book, but I'm not holding it against you. I was not alive for either of those, so it's okay. Tonight, as you heard, we celebrate and discuss another great book from John U. Bacon, but a book that really wasn't even his idea. Someone had to bring him the idea, but it still turned into a masterpiece, so that's the way John works. So, John, I do have some questions for you, like specifically, who picks things like title, cover art, that kind of stuff, and really specifically, do you really put the end of the book in the title? It says right there, Took the Summit Series. That's kind of the end, but you give it away at the beginning. But obviously, it makes it that much harder to do, because in all seriousness, how do you write a book when everyone knows the end? And a lot of people think they know the details of what into it, but that's what John is able to do in this book and flush out a lot of really interesting information. I'm also curious, just amongst us friends, did you do a lot of copy and paste for all those names? There's a lot of Russian names, and they're very difficult with a lot of vowels and a lot of V's and a lot of K's and Y's. And I would like for when you come up here to pronounce things like the base where the Russian team stayed, the name of the barracks. I'd like you to come up here and expertly say all of these things in fluent Russian, because I still can't read them as I'm reading them in the book, because there's some pretty ridiculous names. So I'm assuming copy and paste. So John, 1972, 50 years ago, A long list of 50th celebrations this year come to mind. So we have the Summit Series, Disney World, my wife's birthday. Those all come to mind. But since we're talking about something that took place 50 years ago, and some of us were not here 50 years ago, something that dawned on me when I was reading the book. 1972 seems to be an amazing proof that sports and politics, whether directly or indirectly, are connected and have been for a very long time, whether it's in U.S. or Canada, definitely in the Soviet Union, and of course elsewhere. In case in point, the Summit Series, and it's in this book. And that in itself makes the book compelling. You don't have to, as he said, you don't have to be a hockey fan to be interested in the book, because there's so much more when it comes to this story. And since we're here in Ann Arbor, and this book is about Canada and Russia, I kind of want to bring the book a little closer to home, because we might want to do that, because it's got to be a little of interest to the local readers as well. There are some Michigan local connections in the book, or within the book, or how the book was put together. And I also have a couple of analogies that I want you to think about when you read the book. So the first obvious local connection is Red Berenson played in the Summit Series. So there's that. And he's obviously in the book as well. Another local connection, and John talked about this with us on the radio, is that they went back and put all the games through a modern analytics viewpoint, and he had helped with the Michigan hockey program and their analytics team. So it's a really unique way to look back at a game or a series of games from 1972, because all the advanced analytics that we use now was such a foreign concept then, considering so many things were a foreign concept to Team Canada in 1972. So there's that. And then I had, again, food for thought, some analogies. So when you see the team go off to Moscow and play the games, think about maybe some antics that you've heard about in Columbus before football games, with cold showers and fire alarms and police dogs. And then think about the off-ice shenanigans you read about in Moscow and military people surrounding the rink, and you might see some parallels there. Also, another one, something to think about, Tarasov. That's how you pronounce it? Tarasov? There you go. That's how you pronounce it. You'll read it in the book. He built the Soviets to beat Team Canada, like maybe Jim Harbaugh recently built his football team specifically to beat Ohio State. An interesting parallel. Just something to think about. You may not agree with me, but something to think about when you're reading the book. So John, I have a few questions for you, again, just to throw out there. First of all, in all of your time covering teams, have you ever encountered a better name than the Toronto National Sea Fleas? Might be the best nickname for a sports team I've ever read. Also, I love how you drop nuggets of information into a story that have nothing to do with the story really, but it still adds flavor. Like how Harry Sinnen, the coach of Team Canada, met his wife, essentially as a stand-in on a blind date. It has nothing to do with the series, but it's very interesting nonetheless. And there are all those throughout the book as well. So again, expertly written by my good friend, John U. Bacon. And speaking of that guy, John U. Bacon, I know a guy who wrote a great book on leadership. In fact, the book was a hockey book, if you can. I'm guessing the guy who wrote that book knows a thing or two about, maybe if you don't go through the handshake line, how that might be taken by the other side, or team building and how building teams within maybe when guys were taught to not like each other and now they have to be buddies on the ice, and how there might be some leadership lessons in there. So I'm thinking that you kind of weave some of your last book into this book as well. So you can read that in there. For anyone that's read your books, you can kind of see that theme. Another, again, expertly well-weaved together theme by John Bacon. Sportsmanship, teamwork, gamesmanship, heartbreak, and so much more, all in this terrific book. One more beautifully written book by my good friend. Please welcome John U. Bacon.
Thank you, Ira. And all the Michigan connections, by the way. Even I didn't get all those, so nicely done there, of course. So that's how I'll pitch it now locally from now on. Ton of fun to be here. Thanks for coming out on a Wednesday night, of course, and some folks from far away, I realize, too. Pretty cool. Yes, the previous book is about the worst high school hockey team in America, and this book is about the best hockey team ever assembled. So we're going alpha to omega here on this one. So far, this one's selling better than the Hot Shots, but it'll catch up, I'm sure. So how it came about, Ira's right, dumb luck. They actually asked me to write the book, and I was not expecting that in any way. I was on a book tour in 2017 on Halifax, the Great Halifax Explosion, which I think a lot of you folks might have. That was obviously a fun book to write, but of course you have to go to Toronto for that one, for the book tour. And a guy wrote to me before that, a guy I never met before, and said, please meet with me beforehand for a cup of coffee or beer, whatever else, got an idea for you. So I did, and he's tight with these guys, the Summit Series alumni, Team Canada alumni, which is an official group, and they got their own website and their own tax code and everything else in Canada. And he said they're looking for a writer to do the book, it was their idea, on this Summit Series. And I grew up with this. So I was an 8-year-old kid in Ann Arbor on the northeast side of town. My best buddy that year, a guy named Scott Childs, his dad was Ross Childs. I just passed away about a month ago. Ross was the goalie for Red Baronson's teams at Michigan in the late 50s, early 60s. If you go down to the Pretzel Bill and go down the stairs, there's a picture of a goalie with no mask going like this. That's Ross Childs. These guys are crazy, obviously, but anyway. So the American kids weren't paying much attention to this, but Scott and I did. So when school got out, we'd run home to my house. It was closer, Channel 9 out of Windsor, CKLW, of course. I remember the old logo. They were carrying it so we could get it live from Moscow with Foster Hewitt doing the announcement. And this is like the first summer, fall that I was truly aware of sports. They say around 7 or 8 is when your memories finally start sticking in. For me, that was the Munich Olympics, Mark Spitz, the U.S. basketball team, of course, and that controversy. I recall the Fischer-Spassky chess match on the cover of Time magazine. So I'm learning to read big boy stuff at that point. Mark Mulvoy, I interviewed him for this. He was the longtime editor-in-chief of Sports Illustrated, but he covered the Summit Series and wrote a book with Ken Dryden about it. He said, this is the craziest month in the history of sports. This is all going on at once, and you throw on this thing, which started September 2nd and September 28th. And it's all east-west, it's all crazy, it's all happening at once. And Ted Turner had the great line, he said, you may not care about kayaking, but if one of those guys is a Russian, this guy's an American, you're going to watch it. And back then, all the ratings proved this again and again and again. So Pat Stapleton played for the Blackhawks, was a star on this Summit Series team. He lives in Strathroy, Ontario, not too far from Sarnia. They just named the rink in Sarnia after him, actually. So he drives to Ann Arbor. We spend the weekend together with Red Berenson and the games. We go to P-Bell for a 5-hour meeting, this and that, going over all this stuff. And the deal was that they were going to give me complete access. Now, to a journalist, this is killer. This is all you need to hear, basically. Complete access means I got 4 hours with Phil Esposito in Tampa. I got 3 hours with Harry Sinden, the coach, in his office in Boston. I got 2 hours with Jean Vertel. Brad Park and I, after Pat passed away of a stroke a couple years ago, Brad Park becomes my liaison. He and I are on the phone every week. This is a guy who grew up, he's one of the best 50 players of all time or so. So it was very cool that way. Little fun fact for you Michigan fans. So I'm there talking to Phil Esposito at his hotel, or a place of his choosing. We're there for 4 hours. Across the canal is some graffiti. It is maize and blue. It is the winged helmet, and it says "Go Blue." And whoever did that either had to be hanging from the bridge or in a boat. This impressed me. And I said, Espo, look at that. I said, those are my people. So as Ira pointed out, wherever I went, Michigan was not too far away. So they asked me to do it. The advance was about a third of what I usually get because it's a Canadian-only book. This is only published in Canada. And I still said yes because I grew up with this, and how many chances do you get? And it's not simply, I'm too old to be starry-eyed about athletes, and I really wasn't when I started in this field 25 years ago. And I'm not starry-eyed now, certainly, but the story is so amazing that as an American to get the chance to write it for a Canadian audience was too great to pass up. And as Ira points out, my mom is in fact Canadian, so I am half Canadian bacon. Thank you. By the way, that joke does not work in Canada because they don't call it Canadian bacon, they call it bacon. They're Canadian, so they don't bother with that. Or they call it back bacon, if anything, which is a whole different category, but anyway. So I said yes, and it was. I'm glad I did, of course. I've joked on Canadian TV and radio that these Canadians need an American to tell the story because Canadians, as you know, are way too humble. It's like, no, you guys are really great, promise. So you need an American to brag on your behalf, and that was kind of cool. So that was pretty neat, to say the least, that month I mentioned. So why play the series? The best parallel here, and I don't bother with it in Canada, but you guys will get this one right away. 1992, exactly 30 years ago, was the Dream Team basketball team. That, of course, is Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Michael Jordan and so on. And why was that team put together? Because they're tired of losing to the American college kids, losing to the professionals of the Soviet Union, of course, Lithuania, elsewhere. But you're not a hockey fan, are you, by chance? Now that is a sweater, and by the way, in Canada, it's not a jersey, it's a sweater. So there you go. There we go. If I don't have you, I don't get anybody. So there you go. Thank you, sir. So they're tight, and that's what happened in this case. He mentioned Anatoly Tarasov, the father of Russian hockey. There's some cases, hockey evolved here in North America, Canada, and the U.S. Organically and so on. So did football, so did baseball, not basketball. We know that on December, I think it's 20th, 1891, James Naismith, who's Canadian, by the way, nails a peach basket on the wall in the YMCA in Springfield. That's basketball. We know the day. We know the day that Russian hockey starts. That's in 1946 in January. A 20 by 30 foot outdoor rink. 20 by 30 feet is about the size, not much bigger than my little stage here. All right, at a kids park outside of Moscow. That is the official beginning of Russian hockey, and not an accident. He knew that day he's starting. He had the money for it. They backed him. Tarasov and his great lines, the title of chapter 2 is to copy is to always be second best. So his plan, I was talking to Jean Martel, the Hall of Famer with the New York Rangers, and he said, style, we did not know we had this style. All right? They just played hockey. There was no style. There's no diagrams. There's no systems. There's no we're going to do this, you're going to do that. They just played hockey. All right? And that's the system grew coordinate. Tarasov took the opposite approach, an engineering approach. And he said, basically, whatever they're doing, we're going to do the opposite, because my goal is to get to them as fast as I can. If we try to chase them, they got a 70-year head start. It's not going to work. All right, so instead, when they dump the puck into the zone and chase it, we're going to circle back and regroup and pass and pass and pass. When they try to knock everybody out of the rink, we're going to outskate them. We're going to outcondition them. Okay, they're going to be big, tough brutes with slap shots. We're going to go pass, 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 and little tap-ins on the back door of the net. So everything the Canadians had, they're going to counter along the way. 1946 is when this starts. 1954, they go to their first World Cup, and they win it. They smoke the Canadian representatives 7-2. Now, they're still sending beer league teams from East Lyndhurst, Ontario, the Trail Smoke Eaters from British Columbia, the Penticton V's, et cetera, et cetera. These guys are not very intimidating guys on the grand scale. So the Canadian NHLers dismissed the whole thing as this doesn't matter. What they failed to realize is they underestimated the Russians because they underestimated the teams they were sending. Those were good teams. Back then, you only had 6 teams in the NHL. The original 6 is, you hockey fans know. And back then, they only had 15 players per team. They didn't have a backup goalie. So 15 times 6 teams is 90 players. And back then, everybody in Canada plays hockey. Even my uncle, who's now in his 80s, who's a computer geek and not that good an athlete, he played hockey. Everyone played hockey. The same way we played Little League Baseball in the 50s. Everyone basically was obligated to play. So you had this pyramid of all this great talent going to one place. All right, the guys who they're sending over, they'd be millionaires now in the 32-team NHL, no question. So those were better teams than I thought. But from 61 to 71, the Soviets win all 10 World Cups / Olympics, and by increasingly dramatic scores. So Canadians are sick of this. Screw it. We're going to have our dream team put it together, all NHL team. In 1972, the NHL was 99% Canadian. The All-Star game had about 40 players in the game, and every single one of them was Canadian. There was one Swede, Ulf Sterner, who played in the 60s. There's one American, Tommy Williams, played for the Red Wings. Good guy, by the way. And that was it. That was it. The league was entirely Canadian. So they had no idea what was out there. They sent some scouts from the Toronto Maple Leafs to scout the Soviets, and that's supposed to say, there's your problem. Those guys suck. All right. So these scouts saw a guy named Vladislav Tretiak, and they saw him let in 8 or 9 goals that night and said, this guy sucks. And they didn't say that in those days, of course, but they said, whenever he's in net, we will have a 5 or 6 goal advantage. All right? They saw him, they didn't realize they saw him one game, they saw him the night after his bachelor party. And he was getting married the next day. He had his mind on other things. He said, I was not yet hungover, I was still drunk. All right? So he didn't care about the game. And he ends up being one of the greatest goalies of all time. So, oops, got that one wrong. They had no idea about the conditioning, no idea what they were bringing into the program. So they found out pretty fast, of course. What happens? And also, by the way, these guys, It might have been Team Canada, but as Pete Mahavlich and Brad Park told me, it's a team in name only. The NHL back in those days was designed to make you enemies. You're drafted around 15 or 16 by the Blackhawks or the Bruins or the Montreal Canadiens. You're in their system. If you're drafted by the Blackhawks, for example, you move to St. Catharines, Ontario. When you are 15, 16 years old, you play for the Teepees. Then you go to the big club, and that's the whole show. On this team, by the way, Red Berenson was one of the 3 or 4 players who had been traded. All these other guys spent their entire lives in one system. All right, so you didn't know anybody else. Now at the USA program, it used to be in Ann Arbor, and now it's in Plymouth, of course. The USA program, these guys are best friends. They're roommates. They're classmates. They're teammates from 15 or 16 on, all the Americans, all the Canadians. Then they play against the best Finns, Swedes, Russians, Czechs, Canadians their entire lives. They're already pals with the opposition overseas when you're still in high school. These guys were enemies, did not know each other by design. The NHL had rules to make sure you stayed enemies. You're not allowed to play golf, even at a charity function, with the opponent in July. All right, you had to leave. All right, that's how much they thought these rivalries were part of it. I had a chance to interview Ted Lindsay, ended up being a good friend of mine. Amazing guy, shorter than I am, but he was the leading scorer one year. And certainly, when Ted Lindsay, we did the math on this for a story, for a magazine story once. We calculated around 700 stitches in his head alone. When Ted Lindsay smiled, he didn't know what the hell was going on because it looked like a broken mirror, basically. Are you smiling or laughing or mad? I can't tell. But he told me that in the old days, you play Montreal and Montreal on a Saturday night. All right, then the train goes back to Detroit the next day. Both teams are on it, but the Wings are in one car and the Canadians are in another car. All right, and to get to the dining car, you have to go through the Canadians' club car. So you don't do that. You wait until the train gets to the next station, you get on the platform, you walk around their car, and then go to the dining car. That's how much they hated each other in those days. Make a team out of that. They didn't think they had to. They didn't think it mattered. And Brad Park told me at the All-Star games, you'd have the Rangers here, the Bruins here, and you nod at each other. You acknowledge the fact that the good players are here. No talking in the locker room to your all-star teammates. When Brad Park in '72, a few months before this game, a laser pass in Minnesota in the all-star game to a New York Ranger, to a Boston Bruin, Ted Green, who scores, and he said, and he scored a big goal, the game-winning goal, and he did not so much as look at Brad Park on his skate back to the bench. He said, and I would not have expected him to. There's no looking up, there's no high fives, nothing. You don't even make eye contact. Make that a team. There's your problem. The Soviets, on the other hand, it's Arkangelskaya, by the way, is the barracks. They live 11 months out of the year. They live with each other. All right, they know each other better than they know their wives, their kids, their families combined. All right, this is all you see for 11 months, basically. So those guys are tight, and the Canadians are not tight at all. First game happens. It's at Montreal, and imagine this. You put the dream team together, Michael Jordan and all those guys. You play the Lithuanians, and you get blown out by 40 the first night in, I don't know where, in Chicago, where the Bulls play, all right, so, or Madison Square Garden, your home turf. All right, that's exactly what happens in Montreal on September 2nd, 1972. The final score was 7-3, and jaws are dropping all over the place. The headlines were atomic bomb headlines. And the best one I thought was, hockey myth dies. It's like, wow, that's a little extreme. As Berenson said, everyone thought at that point we'd never played hockey in our lives. We'd forgotten everything. But that's how devastating that was. Ken Dryden was the goalie that night. He's a star in Montreal already, of course, soon to be a Hall of Famer in a few years. They flew that night from Montreal to Toronto. Oh, here's a Berenson quote, I almost forgot. After the game. Oh, hell, Berenson recalls, shaking his head. That was wow. You looked around and no one was talking. No one had to. You didn't know what to say anyway. It was just, what the hell just happened out there? We were in shock. I can think of no better word for it. Everybody who came into the locker room started walking around dazed like there'd been a death in the family. All right, and that's how the Canadians treated this. So they fly that night to Toronto. They got to get up the next morning on a Sunday to practice, and they're going to play them again in Toronto on Monday night. Dryden was the goalie. He got shell-shocked, of course, in that game. Back then, on Sundays, there were no newspapers in Canada on Sundays. The old blue laws were still that strong. You couldn't buy alcohol, and you can't buy a newspaper. All right, how about that on Sundays? He didn't have a roommate that night. There's no ESPN. There's no TSN and so on in Canada. So Dryden told me he went to sleep that night, and as he was starting to get up, his eyes were still closed. And he said, you know what? I don't have a roommate. There are no newspapers. There's no TV. If I don't open my eyes, maybe this didn't happen. He said it was the worst feeling of my entire life. So there they are. They win the next game. They let them tie them the third game in Winnipeg. Fourth game in Vancouver. They kept on getting behind, taking dumb penalties. They lose 5-3. And they got booed lustily in Vancouver. And while this is going on, so Phil Esposito's got to do an on-ice interview after this game. And as Serge Savard said, I see Phil in that TV. He is sweating so much. He has never sweat so hard in his entire life. He was not known as a hard worker in the NHL, but he was that night. But right before he gets on, he told me that there are two teenage kids drinking some beer by the Zamboni, about 15, 20 feet away. And they start yelling at him, say, admit it, communism is better than capitalism, better than Canada, admit it, admit it. And he said that triggered him. That's when he went ballistic with this thing. He gave a 3-paragraph speech, and it is to this day, by the way, the best-known speech in Canada. Not politics, not economics, not history, not business, period, best-known speech. This is Canada, people. So there we go. And he says, to all the people across Canada, we tried. We gave it our best. And to the people that booed us, geez, all of us guys are really disheartened, and we're disillusioned, and we're disappointed in some of the people. We cannot believe the bad press we've got, the booing we've gotten in our own buildings. If the Russians boo their players, then I'll come back and I'll apologize to each and every one of the Canadians. But I don't think they will. And the players never saw this. Some didn't see it for 10 years afterwards. He himself did not see it for 10 more years. But that speech changed the whole tenor of what's happening. All of a sudden, 3,000 Canadians are traveling to Moscow for the games over there. And this is why. So that was pretty cool. They go to Sweden for 2 games in the middle. People forgotten those games, of course. A lot of folks reading the book didn't even know they played those 2 games. Supposed to be 2 exhibitions, no big deal, who cares? Now all of a sudden it's very important. It's very important for a few reasons. One, you've got to become a team, and you're not a team yet. You're anything but. What happens is Guy Lapointe, his kid, Guy Lapointe Jr., whom I've gotten to know, really cool guy. He's exactly 50 years old, I know that. He's born that week, and they all take some beer, go across the street to a park, and get drunk. That's how they became a team. So the great line from Brad Park said, in Sweden, we had no interruptions of family and friends, no media, just us. We were forced to spend a lot of time together. We started to hang out and to talk to each other, really for the first time. The old NHL system had to be broken down. It's amazing what 7 or 8 beers will do. So there was a lot of drinking in those days, and these guys did it, but it worked. So they started to become a team. They also had to figure out what the hell the Soviets were doing. These guys, by the way, only a handful of these guys had ever been overseas, had ever even had a passport. All right, now the best players have passports at 16. They can tell you all about Helsinki. All right, these guys had never been overseas. They'd never played at a big rink before. The Olympic rink is 15 feet wider than the NHL rink. You think, okay, no big deal. It's a huge deal. It's 7.5 feet per size. As Brad Park says, and an NHL rink, guess what? I know exactly where I am. I know the measurement. I know the feel of it. Right here, I got you. I'm about to rail you into the glass. You got to pay the toll, pass the blue line. And now guess what? You got from here to that wall. Oh, crap, you're by me. All right? And then he learned in Sweden, right, after a few games like this, he goes, okay, stay calm. I can't get you there. But if I turn fast and ride you, you can't get to the net. So to play on the international rink, don't stop them at the blue line. Stop them at the hash marks. That's what you do. But you have to learn the game to figure it out. These guys are incredibly high hockey IQs. And Harry Sinnen, who's right up there, of course, made new drills where you weren't allowed to cross into the blue line, past the blue line, until he blew the whistle. So he's learning Soviet hockey. The funny thing is, everyone talks about how much the Canadians learned from the Soviets. The Soviets learned almost nothing from the Canadians. Once the Canadians adapted, the Soviets had nothing, whereas they had a plan B and the Soviets did not. So it shows the strengths and weaknesses of that system, right down to making jeans from central planning. You can make a lot of jeans, but they don't fit you. All right? And the same thing here. They had a great system, but they had no plan B. And Raj Gilbert told me, once they got the hang of it, by game 5 and 6, you could see the Soviet players on the bench look to their coach, and the coach is going, they're out of ideas. So that was pretty interesting. Now, game 5. They're ahead. They're ahead 4-0. All right? And they lose 5-4. Heartbreaking. 5 goals in the third period on Tony Esposito, obviously one of the best goalies out there. Tony and Dryden were the 2 best. Tony is from Sault Ste. Marie, of course, they both are. Tony played at Michigan Tech. I'm a trustee at Michigan Tech. That's a shameless plug right there for Michigan Tech. So There you go. So they lose this game. It's devastating. And you think at that point you're dead, you're done. You're now down 1-3-1. All right, there's a tie there in the middle. And of course, now the 8 games. Think about the 8 games. They had an 8-game tournament. Why? Because they didn't think it was going to be serious. They're supposed to win all 8. So best of 7 was not even a consideration when they drew this thing up. That one tie makes it best out of 7. All right, and now you got a challenge. But now you lost this game. You have to win all 3 in Moscow. You've won 1 game so far. In Moscow, you got the big sheet. You got international rules, international refs, who are horrible, by the way. Their names are Franz Bader and Joseph Kampala. The players called them Bader and worse, were their nicknames. From West Germany. I can't quite prove that they've been bought off, but I'm 95% sure that they were. And how are they bought off? Because the guy in charge of international hockey happened to be a Soviet working out of Moscow who was going to schedule refs for the 1973 World Cup in Moscow 6 months later. Do you want to be a ref in that thing or not? That's the greatest achievement you can get as a referee. And of course, you dangle that for one of these guys. And Joseph Kampala, by the way, was a part-time referee. He's a full-time host in a discotheque in West Germany. This guy's in charge of the most important games in the history of hockey. This is not smart. So there you go. But what happens next? The Canadians who had booed these guys, the Canadian fans in Vancouver, booed them lustily, and all the guys still remember it. All right? They stand up. There are 3,000 of them out of 8,000, 18,000 fans. They stand up with no music whatsoever and serenade them with a beautiful version of "Oh, Canada." When I talk to any of these guys about it, Serge Savard, tough guy, Marcel Dion, Frank Mahovlich, they cannot sit here and tell you about that serenade and not grab a napkin. So I'm with the Mahovlich brothers in St. Catharines, Ontario, Niagara, Ontario, where Marcel Dion has got a restaurant and a souvenir shop, pretty impressive one. And all 3 of them are grabbing napkins, trying and failing to tell me about what it felt like at that moment, the lowest moment of their lives. And now the fans are boosting up out of nowhere. So that Esposito's speech mattered greatly. Now you have support. On the way off, Red Berenson, who's in the stands that night, he played 2 of the 8 games, runs down and starts talking to the guys. And this is from, well, first of all, Pete Mahovlich. Americans are proud to be Americans. They fly their flags wherever you go in the States. You see it everywhere. But Canadians are a lot quieter about it, and maybe because we don't always see ourselves as Canadians. By the way, fun fact for you. When did Canada achieve its independence from Great Britain? 1867 is Confederation. That's when it starts. 1982. There's a bar bet for you that you can win. All right, 1982. It's a 115-year process. Good job, by the way. Confederation starts the process, makes the 4 provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec. That makes them an alliance, basically. That starts the process. So they don't have our history. They don't have our experience of this. The flag we know so well now in Canada, that was from 1966. That was only 6 years old when this tournament starts. And it only became popular during this tournament. They started waving the flags back and forth, and you see it on CBC back in Canada, and they start selling those flags like mad. So that's when that flag becomes the flag. My mom grew up in Canada, a subject of the British Crown under the Union Jack. That was until relatively recently. So that's Pete Mahovlich. We see ourselves as English or French or Maritimers or Westerners, but the emotion of wearing that Team Canada sweater, it got to me. I think all the guys felt that way too. And after Sweden, we weren't Red Wings or Rangers or Bruins anymore. We were Canadians. And we felt that way, and I think we played that way too. Then we lost Game 5, and it was very, very tough. But then all of a sudden, you've got 3,000 people, representing a microcosm of 22 million people at home, waiting for us. Boy, after Vancouver, we were not expecting that. To come off the ice and to hear that, what a proud moment that was. 5 decades after the fact, Mahovlich pauses to collect himself as if experiencing it for the first time. And then they start singing, "Oh, Canada." At this, the 6'5" Mahovlich, a big, tough player, started squeezing out some tears and grabbed a napkin to mop them up, all through a stubborn smile. My eyes are starting to water. That's how much it meant to me. Just tells you how emotional it was, a proud moment. And then Berenson runs in after this to the locker room, and the locker room's obviously dead quiet. And he says, I told them that's the best we've played. We're playing better than they are. We proved it for 2 periods. We had the lead. We are outplaying them. We can beat these guys. And Alan Eagleson, of course, controversial agent, but he's the guy in charge of this whole thing and made it happen. He says, normally, and by the way, pardon me in advance, this book has got a fair amount of profanity in it. It's got about 40 F-bombs, okay? So if you got younger kids, your head's up. Berenson wanted me to pull the F-bombs out. We had a talk in his back deck here in Ann Arbor about this. I said, they're your teammates. And I sent them all their quotes back before they went out to make sure I got them right and so on. And Bob Clark says, do you want me to change anything? And he said, fuck no. So now you know Canada, okay? There you go, Canadian hockey players. So normally when a guy who hadn't played comes in and gives a pep talk, they'll say, fuck off, dimwit. And that's what Eagleson says. But Red, they all respected him and took him seriously. They knew he was not talking to hear himself talk. When he comes in and says, I'm telling you, we can beat these guys, everybody listened. He was in sync with everybody. I was struck by how many things they all remember, and that's something they all remember is Berenson coming in there. He had the respect of the entire locker room. And by the way, without Pat Stapleton and Red, they're the ones who sold me to Ken Dryden and Bob Orr and those guys. So that's how you got an American to write this book. And I'm sure without Red, there's no way. So anyway, Rod Gilbert, the famous little forward, number 7 for the New York Rangers. He's so famous in New York. When you're in a New York cab and you hop in, what happens? A celebrity comes on the speaker, of course, and tells you Yo-Yo Ma, something like that. Rod Gilbert, do not forget your belongings here in the cab, okay? All right, so he's on the cabbies to this day. Passed away just a couple years ago, but we talked in Toronto first. He said, and by the way, they knew it was going to be hard in Moscow, eating borscht and so on. So they sent 300 Canadian steaks from Manitoba, the cornfields. They know what they're doing over there, of course. 300 Canadian steaks for every meal. They're going to eat steaks, of course, and pallets, not cases, but pallets of Labatt beer. Like picked up by a crane, loaded onto, with a conveyor belt onto a plane, all this stuff. And, of course, what happens in Moscow? The black market gets a hold of those things, all right? They're supposed to be at the hotel, and 2/3 of the steaks walk off, all right? 3/4 of the beers walk off, so now they're ticked off. And Brad Park gave me a lot of great quotes. One of them was this: they made a huge tactical error. About the beer and about the wives. They first told them 2 days ago in Sweden, your wives can't stay at the same hotel. They had a team meeting, Esposito running it, and they voted unanimously, if the wives aren't coming, we're not coming. All right, tell them that. All right, they need these games more than we do. So they backed off of that one, and then they're on a bus, about to go to see the Bolshoi Ballet. And then the Soviets are always playing games, head games constantly with the Canadians. They pull the wives off the bus, and then the men come off with them. They said, what are you doing? They said, if they're not going, we're not going. So again, they backed off, but they had to keep on fighting these fights on an hourly basis. KGB inspecting your rooms, all this business. As Brad Park says to me, I don't know what they're told about us, but they made a gigantic tactical errors. All right, they messed with our beer, and they pissed off our wives. You do those two things, you don't know much about hockey in Canada. All right? If you want to piss off a Canadian hockey player, that's how you do it. And here's another thing. If you piss off our wives, they're going to make sure that we're pissed off, and now you got a game. All right? So, and then Rod Gilbert said, sitting there in the locker room after the game, and they're all dejected, and he's sitting there, and then this thought comes to him. They'd stolen our beer and our steaks. And then to make it worse, when we go back to the locker room after the game, they give us this Russian beer, the warm, skunky shit. Not the good cold Labatt's our sponsor sent. All this other stuff, we can deal with it. But they stole our fucking beer. I remember thinking, these pricks will never beat us again. They are not going to win another fucking game. I swear in my heart they felt that way. And then he says again, they stole our fucking beer. Now it's on. So it's on, and now you got the bad refs. Game 6, Dryden is back in net, a very gutsy move by Harry Sinden to put him back in net. He'd blown Game 1 and Game 4, had been miserable. He puts him back in anyway. And his theory was that there'd be too much pressure these last 3 games for one goal that carried it all. So he announced to the team before Game 6, Dryden goes 6, Tony Esposito goes 7, Dryden goes again 8. If you want to see an example of coaching courage, all right, that's a big pile of it right there. If you hire IBM to do, or Microsoft, whatever, to do your office account, no one's ever going to fire you for that, as the joke goes. All right? If you play Esposito the whole way, no one's going to blame you. If you play Dryden and loses either one of those games, you will get the blame, not Dryden. And he knows it's the right move. Harry Sinden, to an amazing degree, blocked out everything else, knowing that his career's over if he loses this thing. So they play the game with Batter and Worse refereeing the game. The Canadians suffer 31 minutes of penalties, and the Soviets 4 minutes of penalties. And I played these games back and forth, by the way. It wasn't that different. So a lot of different styles, and some of these guys were clearly bought off, in my opinion. The Canadians win 3-2. Just a heroic performance. to say the least. So, and Berenson, by the way, assisted in the second goal, a no-look pass to Ivan Conway in front of the net. And obviously, without that, you don't win the series. So, Red was big in that one. Red, by the way, went to Harry after the game and said, "Thanks for playing me again. A good experience." He said, "But I'm not in game shape, and you can't be if you're not in sync." He said, "You have to go with the guys you've been playing the whole time. You can't go back and forth." And when I told the other players this, Paul Henderson says, "That shows you how smart Red is and what a great guy Red is." That's why Red has the respect of everybody in that locker room. Because who else? He said, "If you asked me to play, I would have played. I would have done okay. I wasn't scared to play." But I could just see that this game was played at such a high level. This is the best hockey ever played. And what's amazing is you go back 50 years later and put the tapes in, it is still unbelievably good hockey. And not one shift is taken off on either side. It's the most furious hockey I've ever seen in my entire life. Just back and forth, up and down, and everyone's fighting for their lives. It's Miracle on Ice times 8. It's just that crazy. So they win Game 6. They win Game 7, 4-3. Paul Henderson is going 1-on-4 in the last minute or so of that game. He puts the puck between the two defensemen, jumps around them, picks it up again. They're tripping him. As he's going down, he flicks it, upper shelf, right past the trapper of Tretiak, scored the goal. They win the game. He goes home to his hotel room that night and tells his wife, "I will never score a bigger goal in my life." He was wrong about that. So, Game 8. They're going back and forth. The bad refs are supposed to be out of it. They promised, then they come back in their promise. They're lying through their teeth. They're having summit meetings, literally, during this thing, involving ambassadors, involving Brezhnev to some degree. All this stuff is going back. They're threatening not to play Game 8 because they're going back on their word. And they finally had this BS compromise of a Czech ref they liked, Batia, and Joseph Kompala, the worst ref in the world. So there's the setup there. And, of course, they said the guy they wanted was sick that day, and he's in the stands that night. So, of course, he was not sick. So right there, they're already ticked off. In the first 4 or 5 minutes, they give Kompala. The close ref calls off the play. No penalty, nothing wrong. Kompala from across the ice blows the whistle, comes over, and calls a penalty he had no business calling. He was wrong to begin with, and it wasn't his turf anyway. So there's your second crazy penalty. And as he's skating away, J.P. Parise, Zach is his son, of course, also an NHLer. He bangs his stick like this, which is utterly common. We do it in high school. No one says anything. He does that. And Kompala gives him a 10-minute misconduct for that. And now Parise, go ahead and Google this one. Parise goes to him with two hands like this and comes down like this and stops. Kompala's grabbing the glass. His legs are up like this. All right, he thinks he's going to get it. Everything's going to get it. Parise stops, and that's it. He's kicked out of the game for that one, obviously. Mayhem ensues for about 15 minutes. Alan Eagleson's on the ice. There are fights in the stands with the players, all kinds of other crazy stuff. And finally, the Czech ref said after that, Kompala was so freaked out, he didn't make another call the rest of the night. All right. As a rule, by the way, and I've coached, not at this level, obviously, high school hockey, if the refs are screwing you over, you have two choices. One is to do nothing and hope that things calm down and even out. The other one is to make a big deal of it and hope you can scare the guy into calling the game right. The problem is neither one works. All right, they're both horrible plans, and they don't work at all, and it's a mess. This is the one time I can think of in a big game it actually worked. So the game was called evenly after that, and it should have been. So you're down 5-3 after 2 periods. During that intermission, Soviet official comes in and tells the Canadians if the game ends in a tie, they're still ahead 5-3, but they're thinking ahead. The game ends in a tie, we will declare ourselves the winner for total goals due to that first game being 7-3. There had been no rule set whatsoever. There's no trophy. There's no anything. These are exhibitions. All right, there's no setup whatsoever. And Brad Park told me before they had heard that, they said, "Man, let's just tie this damn thing and get it the hell out of Dodge." That was his quote. And then they come in and say this, and now they come in, and now these guys are breathing fire again. But all the guys said, none of us freaked out. When we're down with 3 games to go, we didn't freak out. We were focused. With 2 goals, we didn't freak out. Although Henderson did tell Dryden, no more, any more and we lose. That's a pep talk for a goalie, by the way. We just let in 5 goals in the first 2 periods. But they weren't bad goals. They're all clean goals. But anyway, so that was their challenge. And I've talked to Mark Messier, God bless him. He wrote the foreword for the book through my friend Pat Hughes here in Ann Arbor. So if you know Pat, I should have brought him down tonight. That's my mistake. I'll do another one. But anyway, should have brought Pat down. But got Messier to write a foreword. He took it very seriously, by the way. We went back and forth 5-6 times. He said, "Oh, we used that word 2 paragraphs ago." He was that detailed in his work. Interviewed Wayne Gretzky. about this. They're both 11-year-old kids, one in Brantford, Ontario, one in northern Alberta. And of course, nobody got a damn thing done in Canada all week. That week, not the schools all basically stopped to watch this thing in the gyms and so on. All the corporations stopped and so on. Gretzky, of course, complained to his dad, Walter, after Game 5. He said, yeah, we're watching the school, but it's a small, grainy, black and white, and you can't see it from the back of the gym. So Walter Gretzky allows his son to skip school, all right, and go next door to the neighbor's house who aren't even hockey fans because they've got a colored TV. And that's a big deal in Brantford, Ontario. And I said, well, didn't you get in trouble for this or, and he said, they knew where I was. Already at age 11. That's pretty cool. More Canadians, and I told this to Gretzky as well, 85% of Canada watched Game 8. 85%. And as Alan Eagle said, he said, what the F were the other 15% doing? How do you explain yourselves in that situation? 85%. You can't get 85% of anybody to watch anything. All right, so there they were. More Canadians saw Game 8 than saw the moon landing 3 years earlier. And they watched the moon landing. All right, and I explained that to Gretzky, and he looked at me like I had two heads, and he shrugged and says, more important. Idiot. Basically, he didn't say idiot, but I got idiot out of that. And Messier said, if they had better ice on the moon, maybe we'd go. There's no point. You can't play anybody up there. So this is how hockey-centric they are. And you have to understand in Canada, imagine, the dream team with Magic Johnson and so on, but that is our only sport. All right? Other nations play hockey. We play hockey. It's our fourth sport, basically. And Canada plays other sports, of course. They care about baseball and other sports. But Canada is the only country in the world where their favorite sport is 1, 2, and 3, ice hockey. And it's not close. That is the national sport. It's how they identify themselves. Harry Sinden gave me a great quote. He said, look, Canada's only known for two things, wheat and hockey, and nobody watches wheat. So this is who we are. This is our identity's on the line. It's our chance to contribute to the Cold War. They're all watching, and they sure enough start off right away. And Sinden said, don't try to get all 3 goals back at once. Don't panic. We've got 20 minutes. We know we can score on this guy. We'll get to him. All right. He said he's more afraid of going down 6-3 than he was about getting a goal early on. He said, we've got to keep on playing defense. Don't pinch yet. We'll tell you when to pinch, when to jump in the zone and all that. So stayed back. They got a goal right away. Esposito, Cornway scores the tying goal. That was another. The light didn't go on. That's another fight. Another 10 minutes on the ice. Eagleson, everyone else, because he wouldn't put the light on, and they're afraid they weren't going to count it. There's no question it was a goal. Everyone knew it was a goal, but out there, who knows? And don't forget, this is just, by the way, a few weeks after the U.S. lost the gold medal, in the U.S. Olympic basketball tournament. They ended the game 3 times in the last, 2-3 seconds, I think. Randy's a big basketball guy. He knows this one. Milgram. What was that? Doug Collins, of course, who made the shot. Of course, ended up coaching the Pistons for a while. Some guy out of the stands, some official had no business being part of this, said they had to redo it, and they did. They lost again. And then did a third time, and it finally worked, and the Soviets won. And to this day, Doug Collins and his teammates have never taken those silver medals. The podium was empty for that. This is 2 weeks later. You think anything can happen, all right? This is craziness, madness, paranoia, and now it's 5-5, and it's worth everything. So in the last minute or so, Paul Henderson's had an unbelievable series. He had the game-winning goal in Game 6, the game-winning goal in Game 7. All right, he's playing the best hockey of his life. His line, by the way, is Ronnie Ellis, Henderson, and Bobby Clark. That was the last line picked out of 35 guys. They weren't supposed to get any playing time until later in the tournament. They played every game. They were the best line in the tournament. They outworked everyone else. So Henderson told me, I did something that night I've never done before, and I never did again. I called a player off the ice so I could get on. The guy's calling off is Pete Mahovlich, a better player than he was. All right, borderline Hall of Famer. He's yelling, Pete, come off, with a minute left. Frank, his brother, Pete's brother, sitting right there, goes, what the hell are you doing? And he ignores him. He said, I had a feeling come over me I've never had before since, in my bones, I was destined to score. And I said, I'm not telling you poppycock and so on. Never had it before, never had it since. I was destined to score. Hops out there, he's on the wing. Esposito, they're bringing the puck up. Esposito stops him. Henderson wipes out behind the net. Esposito stops him and reaches around and just bangs the puck on net. Tretiak does not handle the rebound very well. Puts it right back out in front of Paul Henderson, now alone. Bangs it once, comes back, bangs it twice. It's in. Goal, the place goes nuts. Every school, corporation, etc. in Canada went ballistic at that moment. Ask any Canadian about this. This is, again, the single most watched moment in Canadian history. And there it was. You're Canadian, correct? Where were you?
I was watching it on TV at home, off school.
See? I don't know if people took attendance that day across Canada. There's no point, I guess. You remember that moment the rest of your life? There you go. Pretty cool. I was at my home in Ann Arbor, so watching the same thing. So going nuts, of course. The guys went nuts. Paul Henderson was about to go back out on the ice. His line is out there now with Ellis and Clark. And Sinan said, you guys. And Henderson said, no, Harry, I can't go. And he said, I've never been so terrified. I've never been so confident in my life than I was with 34 seconds left. And never more terrified than I was with 33 seconds left. He basically said the magic powers he'd been riding for a month had vanished. He went back to being an average player, above average, good player, but not a great one. He said he was terrified to go back out there. He said, Harry, I can't go. And so he sent somebody else out there, and he sat on the bench and hoped like hell his teammates held on to it. And he said, even in the locker room afterwards, Esposito told me, walking up to seeing Paul in the corner, I looked at Paul like he'd aged 10 years, like he'd run 3 marathons. He looked like whatever he had been spent, and it was. The magic had been spent at that moment. So the game ends, of course. They win. Everyone goes nuts. The Summit Series, where does it place in history? I would argue it's Brad Park who gave me the title. We're talking in Toronto a few years ago. He said, this is the greatest comeback of all time. Never has one team been so favored to win and then so unfavored to win, all right, in the same series. The Canadian press and fans gave them no chance whatsoever to win once they lost Game 5. They were done, dead meat. So even Mark Mulvoy said no chance. All these guys said no chance, but they always believed. And I looked it up, and, it's apples and oranges and hand grenades and whatever else. But you look it up and you see what else they got out there, and I think it was the greatest comeback of all time. There are a few other comparisons, but not many over this period. 28-3. Oh yeah, the Patriots fan, of course. So, yes, the Patriots, of course. 28-3. We know about that. That's one game, Beeve. That's one game. This is 3 games on foreign turf. That's why it's harder. Well, imagine the NFL champion goes to play the CFL champion, okay, in Toronto. Actually, they play it. Why not play it at Lambeau Field in Green Bay, one of the hell things, and you get your butt kicked by 30 the first night. You lose throughout the United States. You got to go to Toronto to play the rest of them. Their field, their rules, their refs, all right, and you have to win all 3 games, and then you finally do. So that's what happened here. So I would say it's the most unifying moment in Canadian history. Confederation starts 1867, but they don't finish that until 1982. All right, so where's the sense of unity that comes from that? Not there. World War I, World War II are shared sacrifices and shared triumphs, obviously, with the rest of the Western Bloc, naturally. This is Canada's alone. All right, is that one of the few things that is Canada's alone. All right, and everyone's watching it. Everyone knows exactly what the terms are, what the rules are, what's going on. I wrote about Jackie Robinson back in 1997, a week-long series of articles for the Detroit News, which Alan Witt asked me to write. I was always very proud that he asked me to do that. I've always maintained that Jackie Robinson is by far the most important athlete, single athlete, important, not the best, all right? The most important athlete of all time. No one changed more of the world's landscape than he did. I might argue this is the most important team of all time because this team made Canada a nation in a way that nothing else really did. And during this time, 67 on, when Charles de Gaulle comes to Canada, French versus English, the fight is on. There's violence in Canada during this month. The French-English, people are dying during protests and bombings and so on. Some crazy stuff, kidnappings, you name it. This made Canada a country. So with this, I say, I close with this. The Zen maxim is simple: be here now. But it's very hard to do. Our minds seem determined to dwell on past problems and imagine future ones, focusing on pretty much everything but the here and now. An already difficult task becomes that much harder when we're in high-pressure situations and things are going badly. But these players, under the toughest competitive circumstances any athletes I've ever seen, now had to do exactly that, focus solely on the present without getting pulled down by the 3 games they had already lost, or daunted by the 3 games they still had to win, with 0 margin for error. It is so rare in life that we really do truly live in the moment, and almost unheard of for anyone to do so simultaneously with 3 dozen compatriots and with the world watching. They were attempting to achieve not just one of the most difficult deeds in sports history, but one of the most elusive feats of human potential in any field of endeavor. Everybody exceeding their limits at once together. It was an honor of a lifetime to tell this story. Thank you very much.
Oh.
We got time for some questions, I believe.
Yeah, so we have time for a couple of questions. Just so everybody can hear, I'm going to just go with the mic, and we've got our first question right here.
Well, hey, John.
Pete Mooney of the Michigan Daily, everybody.
You alluded to the fact these guys weren't teammates, but how much their struggles were the fact they were not like a team versus the Soviets or Russian style play, and how much was it they're not teammates versus a different style of play they weren't used to?
The answer is yes.
Both? Okay.
Their problems are mainly those three problems. One, they had no idea about the Soviet style of hockey and how it could be very difficult to stop. The scouting was horrible. They didn't take it seriously, of course. That's one problem is apples and oranges styles of hockey. Two is the conditioning. So the style of hockey they started figuring out in Sweden. Then they got it more or less right in Moscow the rest of the time there. The conditioning, they were still not at 100% at the end of the tournament. But they were around 80, 90%, they said. They said, the guys who were playing in those games were close enough that with enough heart, we could make that more or less a wash. The teammate thing was the third thing and really the first thing they had to face. And that was all part of it. What happened also, which I didn't want to take too much time just on my little talk there, that the discontent players, because he had 35 guys, and they're all supposed to play. Vic Hadfield, who scored 50 goals that year for the New York Rangers, who almost beat the Bruins in the Stanley Cup final that year, he got pretty pissy about the whole thing, and finally Sinan says, get the hell out of here. So after Game 5, he puts Sinan on a plane going home. And then Gilbert Perreault, who'd played in Game 5, he starts getting moany about it. Rick Martin, of course, another great player, the French connection for the Buffalo Sayers. By the end of that day, there were 4 guys on a plane going out of there. And the guys on the team said that's when the team bonding thing was done. Everybody left is on board, and everybody who's not on board is gone. And they all said, look, and none of those guys did, well, a couple of guys did. But most of the guys did not disparage them for leaving, but they said, I'm not going to disparage them for leaving, but thank God they did, because that's when our heads were clear for the last 3 games. We had one problem, it's the Soviets, and that's it. So that's when those 3 things were all part of the process. I think one of the beautiful parts, one of my favorite chapters to write, is after the fact, years after the fact. Yvonne Cornway won 10 Stanley Cups in his career. My favorite player growing up, used to draw pictures of him. I tried to find one in my parents' old box of stuff, and I couldn't find it. It's there somewhere. I'll find it someday. But I got a chance to know him in Toronto, and then a month ago we're in Toronto. I'm drinking with Serge Savard and Yvonne Cornway till 3 o'clock in the morning. That was cool. And they're great guys, and he's funny as can be. But Cornway has said, I have won 10 Stanley Cups, and these are my best friends. That 1 month is what did it. It sealed it. And when I see Phil Esposito, I don't see the Bruin I hated. I see my teammate I loved. Big difference. And Phil asked him, his shoulders worked on, Cornway, and he's the Roadrunner. He's a very funny guy, very quick guy. And Phil says, that's I'm sure from your bad shoulder pads, all your shoulders. No, Phil, it's from raising the cup over my head too many times. And then when they won the thing, they're in the locker room. They had 3 locker rooms, just so crappy in Moscow that you had offense in one room, defense in another room, and the coaches in a third room. It was miserable. So Conway's sitting there, they're all just spent. They're not celebrating that much. They're just, And he's sitting next to Dennis Hull. Now, Bobby Hull, of course, won a cup in '62 with the Blackhawks, but Dennis came on later. They came close, a couple of years, '71 and so on, Game 7 with Dryden. But he never won one. And that's, if you're a hockey player and you're that good, your whole life, that's the thing. You got to win. So he turns to Cornway and says, Yvonne, tell me, is this what it's like to win the Stanley Cup? And Cornway turns to him and says, you don't have one. And he knows damn well he hasn't got one. The old joke there is that you don't go on down to the store and get 3. They're very hard to get. And then he says, this is 10 times better. And the guys who never won cups, like Dennis Hull, he said, nothing has made me feel better about my career than that did. So these guys to this day, they go to each other's weddings, funerals. you name it. They're unusually bonded for a team that was together for about 7 weeks. And the weird thing is they come back, and Canada's still celebrating, but Bobby Clark goes to Philadelphia. He said no one had any idea what the hell I'd just been through. It wasn't on TV in Philadelphia. No one cared, and they had no sense of it whatsoever. So that was kind of weird. And it's kind of like the Miracle on Ice. They disbanded the next day. There's no official anything. That was it. So they've had events since then, and of course there are fewer guys each time. But the unity of these guys is a ton of fun, and it's not French, it's not English, it's not Ontario versus the Western Plains and all the rest. This is an unbelievably unified team to this day. So yes, sir. Nice hat.
Yeah, thank you, John. Good to see you. You're right. I think about the effect on Canada. I'd like your opinion regarding how it changed. Well, it's gonna question. It's a statement. I think it changed how we viewed international, especially Russian hockey.
No question.
Growing up in Canada, right? I remember the Trailblazers. I remember all those little podunk teams
That's
that we
right.
would send to fight against, to play against the Red Army and all these, all these teams
Pro
that
players,
clearly
right.
had full state support, and we ignore them because our best players were in the league, right? But after
So it didn't count. Right.
After this, I mean, Russian hockey became much more serious. Tretiak, I think he's considered, in my opinion, one of the top 5 goaltenders
Easily.
in history.
Tretiak's one of the top 5 goaltenders of all
Easily.
time.
Easily.
He's the only Russian goaltender in the Hall of Fame. He's never played a game in the NHL. He's in the NHL Hall of Fame. That's how the respect they had for him was. The scouts were a little off, all right, on that one. So, oops.
By the way, he was drafted by an NHL team
I believe it.
in 1996
1996.
by the same team that drafted Patrick Roy,
Ah,
and he never played a game, right? But Canadians, we drafted him.
there you go. It did unify them. And by the way, this also changed hockey forever. All right, now you're playing the hybrid style that Harry Stinnen figured out in about a week is the style you watched tonight. When the Rings were riding high in the 90s, that's what they were playing. They had big, tough Canadians who were rock and sock you, of course, and then they had the 5 Russians, they had the Swedes, they had some Czechs mixed in and so on. And then Konstantinov, guys like that, the Russians now could hit. All right, that's when you know the game has gone full circle, of course, at that point. All Herb Brooks did in 1980 was did what Stinnen did in 1972. And the NHL was slow to pick up on it, but Herb Brooks, when they beat the Soviets in 1980, the Miracle on Ice, that's what he did. He took the best from both worlds and made it the hybrid style. The Swedish, those 2 games, by the way, that's when you start getting Inga Hammerstrom is in that, Borja Salming, guys like this. They start playing for the Maple Leafs. From those 2 games, everyone figured out that, wow, these guys can do it, and now you get Swedes. The league now, by the way, was 99% Canadian, 72. It's now 47% Canadian. There's no way in hell you're getting 32 teams around North America without the Americans, the Swedes, the Czechs, and the Soviets. So that made hockey what it is today. So, and by the way, it's also about the only international sport I can think of where there are 6 nations that are almost equal. The Big Six, they're called, and any one of them could win the thing any given tournament. And that's what makes international hockey great and fun to watch. So, yes.
Okay, so I think we have probably just time for one more question, so we have time for the signing. I think I saw you first.
We'll squeeze 2 in. I'll give a shorter answer, I promise. We'll squeeze 2 in.
You mentioned Bobby Clark
Yes.
earlier. I grew up in Philadelphia, where he's a hockey legend.
He should be.
And you're absolutely right. We did not watch the series.
And you didn't know. It's not on
We
TV.
didn't know about it, right. So my question is, did Bobby Clark do anything of note in the series?
Oh, yes. He was several things. He was the player of the game at least once, maybe twice. He was the straw that made that line what it is. And those guys say that. They had Norm Ullman between Ronnie Ellis and Paul Henderson in Toronto. But Clark was a younger version, feistier, of course, and all that. He had a phenomenal series. A local angle, you mentioned that. Evan Hall is the videographer of the University of Michigan Hockey. He's their analytics guy, basically. And I gave him the 8-game set and $1,000, and I said, do what you do for Michigan, do it for me, and break it down. And he did it with great care and intelligence and filtered it through our modern analytics, which are very different than what they had back then. It was very shots and goals are a very stupid stat. All right, if we're on a, if I flick one in from the far blue line and it bounces on net, that's a shot on net. Okay, and if we're on a 2-on-1 and I get a great chance and I shoot wide, which I'm inclined to do, all right, and I shoot wide, that does not count at all, even though that one's far deadlier, of course, than the flicking. Chances are what you care about, all right, and that's a judgment call by a smart guy like Evan Hall. So chances are when you we get a chance for that. The flick in from mid-ice doesn't count. All right, so he did chances, then he did plus minus with chances, who's on the ice, who's not on the ice, and so on, and broke down all kinds of stuff. What's amazing is Harry Sinden, the coach of the Bruins in this team, without any of those analytics, figured out, and the stats, after each game, I got a little section on that. The stats worked perfectly what Sinden was deciding. Hadfield was horrible in this series. He was not built for this. He's a big lugging forward. He's not fast enough. All right, Rod Sealing, great guy, great player, but not fast enough for this kind of stuff. Serge Savard worked out great in this series. Ivan Conway, great in this series. So that's what he figured out on his own. So the question was, Bobby Clark. Bobby Clark was one of the best players in this tournament. He did have the two-hand whack, as you know, on Kharlamov's ankle. I gave that about 3 or 4 pages in this thing. It is the most controversial thing. Whenever I post anything on this in Canada or on Twitter, Canadians say, yeah, but Bobby Clark whacked him. All right, so yeah, he did. It's a two-hand whack right in the ankle. You can't spin it. It's unsportsmanlike and so on. But what I learned when I went back into the annals, that at the time it happened, nobody cared about it. Foster Hewitt, the announcer, who's very sharp, and you could see it, he didn't even mention it. Brad Park is 10 feet away. He's playing defense. He said, I didn't even notice it, didn't even know it happened until people started yelling about it afterwards, and he's 10 feet away. Ken Dryden, Harry Sinden, and Brad Park all kept journals throughout this tournament, and Mark Mulvoy did as well, the Sports Illustrated guy. Not one of them mentioned that in their notes when they got home that night. The next day, the Soviets met with the Canadians, the officials did, to complain about 3 things. They had a list ready to complain about Bergman, about something, and Clark was not on it. All right? I'm not saying it's sportsmanlike. I'm not saying you just wipe it off. If you take it out of context and you blow it out of proportion, it becomes something that it wasn't. And again, I mean, one of their playoffs kicked Bergman in the ribs and drew blood. I mean, it was a dirty series. A lot of crazy stuff was happening. Jean Rotel had won the Lady Byng Award for sportsmanship, and he's taking runs at guys. All right, that's how crazy the whole thing had gotten. So I am here to defend, on the grand scale, Bob Clark, who, by the way, I'm pleased to report, let them lead and bought a box for his coaching staff. So I love Bobby Clark. He's a class guy. He gave me 2-3 hours in his office in Philadelphia. We had time for one more quick one?
Yes.
Beef.
Professor Bacon.
Sir.
I say this in all sincerity. You've written some incredible books. This is probably your best work, and that's like saying it's Michael Phelps' best swimming. So that was pretty good. I haven't been able to read the whole thing. I'm kind of busy. It's football season.
Well, maybe it sucks. You don't know.
Okay. No, what I read.
Second half.
First of all, thank you for all the nice things you said about Harry Sinden.
Deserved.
Yes, thank you. And the Herb Brooks thing, I think, is amazing, because I think he set a lot of seeds for 80 by watching this with the Bobby Clarks, the checking guys, the Chris
Absolutely.
Draper types. Instead of putting together an all-star team to beat the Russians, you need, the Gary Bregmans, the Pat Stapleton and Whites, those type of guys, the checking guys, what Coach Berenson was, where he was a role player. But the thing I think is fascinating, I've looked at, and you're setting the seeds here for what happened in the future, the Alan Eagleson stuff. I grew up in Andover, Mass. My buddy Russ Conway wrote Game Misconduct with your buddy Brad Park and Bobby Orr, and you have some tremendous stuff in here. Esposito and Brad Park were very suspicious of Eagleson. Mm-hmm. This was in '72, and when did the Eagleson things happen? So I think that's incredible. Great job, tremendous job.
Appreciate that. Eagleson, if you don't know, a very controversial figure in Canada, to say the least. He ended up doing some jail time. He screwed around with the pensions and other finances. He ran half the league for a while. The team is divided about Eagleson. Brad Park, Bobby Orr, Jean Martel, Phil Esposito want nothing to do with him. Other guys are still very close to him. I played it as straight as I could and said, and I mentioned the jail time and why he got it, and he deserved it. There's all that. The flip side is that at this time he wasn't doing any of those things, but he was the mastermind behind the series. He's the one who fought for the refs. He's the one who got the guys in the planes, and everyone said, look, it was Sinden's team, but it was Eagleson's show. And about that, I would say. I don't want to put words in Red's mouth. He was going to be here, but he's in New Mexico right now. It's a pretty good excuse. But they're certainly at least cordial, and I think they're more than that probably. And keep in mind that Red was the NHLPA president for a while. And every team is always the representative, so he dealt with Eagleson quite a bit.
So just to help, I know there's 3 guys on this team who didn't win the Stanley Cup.
At least 3.
Brad Park,
Yep.
unfortunately Marcel Dion,
Yep.
and Dennis Hall. I don't know about
Rod Gilbert, Jean Martel,
the Rangers.
about 5 or 6 guys.
The Rangers guys.
Most of these guys would win it. But
1,
Yep, there we go. We'll have that one over a beer. So anyway, hey, thanks y'all for coming down. You Americans have done me proud. Thank you.